Amazing. Well, it is such an honor to be here for South by Southwest in this standing room only crowd, since this is being recorded. There's uproarious applause. It is amazing to be here talking to people that have served in so many different ways and know this market inside and out. So obviously, we're thrilled to have you. And let me tell you a little bit who you guys are so lucky to hear from. We have Alexis Ross-LaSalle, who I had the privilege of getting to meet in the Pentagon. We met when she was in the Army. She was driving acquisition reform or changing the way the Army buys. And then the next time I got to see her, she had elevated like 10 levels, and she was actually working for the Secretary of Defense as the Deputy Chief of Staff. So it was incredible to see you again. And of course, there's so many other things you bring to the table. You have Hill experience, you have the industry experience, and strategic planning at the big primes, and you're at CSIS and also NDIA. So incredible to have you here. Thank you. And also, I'd point out, you've now hung out your own shingle as well. So also an entrepreneur. And then we also have Dan Guac. Dan is one of the godfathers of this whole field. So first of all, talk about on-the-ground experience. Infantry Marine himself kicked in his share of doors, not only hypothetical, figurative doors, but real doors. And then went to InQtel, which is the investment arm, the venture capital arm of CIA and the intelligence community. And from that, one of the most important and influential venture capitalists that has really a thesis investing in this space. Really one of the people that was investing in defense tech before it was hot, before it was a hashtag. And then, not to be outdone, of course, Chris and I have shared a lot of adventures together, let's just say. Chris had many different roles in Washington, served uniform leaders at the highest level, served civilian leaders at the highest level, served the White House at the highest level, all in different national security posts. But the thing he's probably going to talk about the most, and where he and I got the chance to work together, was as one of the plank owners, or as we say, founding members of the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, back when it was called DIUX. And plenty of scars that he bears from fighting the battles with the private sector, fighting the battles internal to the bureaucracy. And so you have incredible perspective here to help walk us through their topic today. And our topic today is all about this market, the good, the bad, the ugly. And with that, we're going to jump right in. I'm going to ask a quick rapid fire opener for each of you and say, like, so I think we all get the sense that this market is having a moment right now. You wouldn't have seen a panel like this at South by Southwest 5 years ago. And in fact, there's actually tons of things going on at South by around this subject. So it really feels to me like we're having a moment in defense tech. But each of you, as I was alluding to in your intros, were drawn to national security a decade earlier. So just to set the audience, what is it about you that made you want to be in this space? You saw something before anyone else did. You were drawn to this for a reason. I'd love to hear you say, what was the reason?
I will go first. Okay, so honestly, I cannot remember, because I came right to DC and went right into defense right out of college. And I knew that I was going to be doing that, and even my major was in, but I mean, I picked that in high school, and I don't really remember why. So it
just runs deep for you.
Yeah.
It's just always been there.
Yeah, probably a more interesting question is really, how did I get into defense innovation and acquisition? How we buy weapons, that one. So that was a little interesting. So I came, like I said, right after college, started working in defense policy on the Hill and in a variety of topics, logistics, military personnel policy, things like that. And about more than 10 years ago, I had a job working on a commission. These are like these blue ribbon panels, quick 2-year things, let's fix the government in some way. And there was one on military compensation. And so I was in charge of setting up, proposing a new healthcare benefit to replace TRICARE. So if anybody knows what that is, it's like the military thing. Don't worry, it didn't get adopted. So if anybody ever wants to replace TRICARE, it's sitting on the shelf circa 2013. It's a great program, but I got a bug for reform. And reform is like, the fancy government term for large-scale change.
Fixing stuff.
Got it. So I went back to the Hill, got into acquisition reform.
Got it.
Went into the Army as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy and Acquisition Reform, doing that again, implementing some of the stuff that we had put into law in Congress. So that's
fixing. I got it. Dan, how about you?
So, I enlisted in the Marine Corps because I felt that calling, that purpose to serve the nation. And it wasn't meant as a career change for me, right? I'd already been an investor, and then I enlisted in the Marine Corps, and then I came back to investing. I really thought I'd do one enlistment and be done with it. But what I found is that, you go to a place that's as mission-driven and as purpose-driven as the Marine Corps, and you find yourself surrounded by people who also feel that way, and the energy you get from that is something that really you can't get anywhere else. And so, the way that chapter ended for me, I felt like wasn't really on my own terms, right? I'd gotten wounded and medevaced, and so I felt like I wasn't done. That's why I went to In-Q-Tel, right? And in In-Q-Tel, I kind of fell in love with the tech and all the, kind of nerding out that I got to do on the venture side. But what I found was that, in defense tech or dual use tech, as we were looking at it back at In-Q-Tel, you get a group of people who are super purpose-driven, mission-driven, and just passionate about what they do, right?
Right.
And that is a great place to look for founders, right? Like what you want is a group of founders who you could tell them not to do this thing, and they're just going to do this thing in their sleep because that's the thing they're passionate about, right? And so, really, I feel like the job of a venture capitalist is to find great markets and great founders who are going to go after those markets. For a long time, it wasn't obvious that this was a great market. I think that's finally starting to shift.
We're going to come back to that. Yeah.
But that's really what got me started in defense tech, and what's kept me here is just the passion of the community and the folks that are starting businesses.
And I love that because it's easy to portray these different aspects of finance and capital and investing as being motivated just by the financial return. But one of the things that just emanates off of you is like how much you're mission driven in this pursuit. Successful at the business, but also driven by the mission. And I think that's going to be a theme we'll come back to. I know that's true for each of us. But Chris, what brought you into this?
In 2009, I was a young aide at the Pentagon. And in my personal life, I had an iPhone. And I had a MacBook Air, the one that like Steve Jobs pulled out of the manila envelope. It was amazing, this sexy computer. And I show up at the Pentagon, and they hand me a BlackBerry and a Dell laptop that's 4.5 inches thick.
Yep.
And the damn Dell laptop was so bad, I had to start it up 3 times each time just to get it working once. The email system was so bad, I was working on a project with Vint Cerf. One of his emails bounced. When the founder of the internet can't get through, you have a problem with your IT. And I realized that it wasn't just the BlackBerry and the Dell. I realized that the Pentagon itself was full of tech that was behind the curve. And so I wanted to be part of the change.
That's great. Let me take you back to that behind the curve moment and ask you to share just a couple of minutes of atmospherics about what it was like to show up, in the empty room on Moffett Field and be told, okay, you guys are going to start the Silicon Valley embassy of the Pentagon.
Yeah, so it was wild getting the mission from Ash Carter to open up the Pentagon's first office in Silicon Valley. And I'll tell a story that happened just a year and a half or so before we got started. And that was General Dempsey, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 4 stars, armored Suburbans, the whole, the comms team. He said, Chris, can you take me to Silicon Valley? I do this thing, it's called the Campaign of Learning. And the way it works is either I learn something or you get fired. So I thought, okay, we got to make this a good trip. So I took General Dempsey straight to Google X, and he wanted to see the self-driving car. So there was the Prius and Astra Tellus with the Prius with the radar dome, down at the Google headquarters. Now, we were very clear that General Dempsey was supposed to look at the car, but not get in it and drive around, because we're talking about the armored security people.
Generals really want to get in self-driving cars.
So, of course, what does General Dempsey want to do? He said, boys, let's take this thing for a drive. So off the Prius goes, the security people chasing after it. I figure now I'm going to get fired for sure. And he came back and said that was an unbelievable ride around the block. The car was in fully autonomous mode. There was a bicyclist. The car saw it. We moved over to the lane and then moved back. He asked the guys, the Google X guys, how much hardware is on this car that allows you to do that? And they said, the LiDAR, the sensors is about $3,000. And right then, this light bulb went off in General Dempsey's head. It wasn't just that Silicon Valley was making iPhones. They were making things that were so relevant to the military that we weren't taking advantage of.
I love the sly Google placement, by the way, in your story, Chris. It was not a plant, thank you. So that begins this journey, and you mentioned Ash Carter and Dempsey and others, that they're starting to think about what's going on here. And today, I think we're in such a different place. We have now the opposite problem almost, which is, so many people are trying to find their way into this market, and it is a pretty opaque market. So I wanted to ask you, Alexis, when your clients are coming to you, seeking your counsel, asking like, how do we get into the now DIU 3.0, much bigger, larger organization? Doug Beck was here at South by talking about all the progress they've made. What is motivating them to want to break into this, and what's the advice you're giving them?
So I've seen a lot of different companies. They're all coming in different phases or stages. I would say ubiquitous, or like it's a common thread throughout, that they're all very mission driven. So they're all very insistent about providing new technology and more innovation to the warfighters, making sure that, I'm seeing this more even lately, making sure that the U.S. is prepared for a potential fight with adversaries in the future. And I think more people are starting to wake up to the China threat.
Sure.
And so I'm seeing a lot more of that. So I would say there is not a single company that is not the motivating factor, which is great, right? Because it's not all about making profit. Obviously, that's important in capitalist society, but it's also really important that we're understanding what it's all for. And I get it. I mean, I've dedicated my entire adult life to public service as a government civilian. So that is the common theme.
And Dan, for you, Point 72 has really made a thesis around this. And I think we look at there's a lot of investors out there, but I think you in particular and your company is known as being one that's like really good at picking the defense technology and its wins. And so tell me a little bit about how do you win over your fellow VCs in this? And tell me a little bit more about what's animating your position in this. What's driving you?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the compliment. Look, I think when you pull back, at the end of the day, every important thing should be simple. If it seems really complicated, you're probably too in the weeds, right? And so when you pull back enough, like, why is defense tech interesting, and what types of startups can be interesting in defense tech? To put it the most simple way that I can describe it, it needs to be consequential to the global superpower balance, right? If you are starting a company that has the potential to shift the global superpower balance between the US and China, right? Then if you are successful in bringing to market that product, you'll figure everything else out, right? And so if at Point 72 we are correct in figuring out the themes that we think can be influential in that power balance, and we are correct in picking the right teams that are well equipped to go after that, we're not going to be wildly wrong, right? And so that's kind of like how I would synthesize it down. There's a lot to figure out and a lot of complexity to sort through between starting a company and getting to a successful place. And that has all kinds of complexity that a lot of the folks in this room are probably familiar with, like contract types, the right types of customers, and how do you get adoption, and all those complicated things. And look, we can help with all that. I think smart founders are good at figuring all that stuff out on their own as well. But the number one thing to get right is, hey, is this a consequential enough problem to approach as a startup? Because if it's incremental, the primes are going to eat your lunch every day, and they probably should, because this is a market that has tremendous advantages to incumbency.
On that point about if it's consequential for moving the needle in this great power competition, I wanted to ask you, Chris, to say a word about your recent trip to Ukraine, because that is not the U.S.-China conflict you mentioned, Alexis, but it is where we are all focused on it. And someone made a really interesting comparison for me, I thought about, which is, we make a lot about the history of blitzkrieg warfare in World War II as being a major disruption of both technology and a concept of fighting. But they pointed out that any student of history that was looking at the Spanish Civil War would have seen blitzkrieg 5 years beforehand. And the analogy is like what we're seeing unfolding over the skies in the battlefield in Ukraine is actually a window into the US-China competition that Alexis referred to. And so I wonder if you would share a little bit about your observations from the field about your time in Ukraine and what you think that tells us about Dan's point about, where are the technologies that are going to really move the needle in a contest between industrialized militaries.
You know, those of us at DIU and in the innovation community for a long time knew that UAS, that drones are going to be a really important part of our future on the battlefield. And you go to Ukraine, which I got a chance to visit for 3 days last fall, and you see it in a way that is so powerful. Incredibly inexpensive quadcopters, that are made for, less than a couple $100, right? Mated with a shell, and we're off to the races. And not only do you have autonomous killer drones working, but you have a whole software stack that's behind that, that's been made by Ukrainian companies through open source software that essentially combines AWACS, video feeds, Intel. I mean, it's a really impressive construction. It is a glimmer of the future. One important historical fact to tie this back to Blitzkrieg, the Germans only had radios in 10% of their tanks. Blitzkrieg was a very narrow technological innovation, but yet you could see the future through it. And I think Ukraine for the defense innovation community is not only a vindication, but a window into where we're going. And I know that it's the Pentagon still yet has to fully turn the supertanker, but boy, Ukraine has caused that turn to accelerate. And I think that's really exciting for this community.
Sure. Although, not to be too cynical about it, but when I hear comparisons to what's going on in Ukraine inside the Pentagon, I have to ask the officers, do you think we're Russia or Ukraine in this comparison in terms of how rapidly we are able to adapt to a new technology? And so that brings me back to you, Alexis, which is you really started your career in acquisition reform. And when I look at the rate of the cyclic rate of iteration in Ukraine, how would we match that? I mean, I know we've launched the Replicator initiative, and you might share with people what the Replicator initiative is, but a lot of people don't think that we can get the acquisition machinery to move fast enough to make Replicator happen. What do you think?
Setting Replicator aside.
Okay, set Replicator aside.
For the record, I do think there's a mixed opinion on Replicator.
Fair enough.
I actually applaud the Department of Defense for putting senior leadership attention. And while it is not necessarily or hasn't been a funded program of record, I think that in a way it's more like a process-oriented type of activity. And in acquisition, I think that sometimes galvanizing that process to move it can be important, and moving it with a senior leader attention is critical. So I'm gonna, setting that aside. The system has its challenges. It has its merits and demerits, right? A lot of work's been done to try to improve it. Starting about 10 years ago now, maybe more. Congress, this is a full court press. All bodies of government have been involved, Congress and DOD. And acquisition reform is a perennial pastime in DC. There's multiple bouts that have been going on since the 70s, right? So this is not new. It's just this last round has been very focused on speed and innovation. And I think there's some good things that have come out of it. Some things I don't know that we've really hit the mark. So you're probably wondering what I'm going to actually say.
Go for it.
So I think the good things that have happened, I do think, although it is slow and it takes some time to get there, I do think the system is inculcating a lot of the new authorities and the streamlining that have happened. So I think that we got after some things with new pathways that can let some of these systems move through the acquisition process a little quicker. We've got some flexibilities, like more use of other transaction agreements instead of full-blown contracts. There's delegation of authorities and management, which means that in some cases, smaller programs don't even have to come to the Pentagon for review and approval. And that's a big deal because that stuff takes a lot of time. And on the innovation side, there's a lot more outreach. A lot of laws were changed to try to attract some of the non-traditionals. For example, a lesser known example, but it's very consequential, is that we changed the rights in intellectual property so that it was before that DoD would try to acquire as much of the IP as possible. Now it's in law changed where it has more to do with who funded what, and making sure that you get only what is necessary. So all of that's working, I think, better. It just does take some time. But there's a couple of things that come to mind that we probably didn't hit the mark on. off the top of my head, I'm not so sure we needed to break up OSD, AT&L, the acquisition technology and logistics.
Definitely not going back there.
Yep.
That's
that's
a great topic for
burn a lot of
next.
calories on that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
that's a good.
I don't know if that
Next
would be
time we're at NDIA, we'll
Yeah.
talk about that one.
Yeah.
I don't know if that'll.
Yeah.
A lot of reorganization. Let's put it that way. A lot of reorganization. Let me pivot back to the markets, Dan, and ask you a follow-up question, which we did see a couple of years ago. I feel like there was a real overheating of the space. Certainly some runaway valuations. People have predicted we're going to see some down rounds for some of the what at the time looked like blue chip players, and then of course we had like a big macro adjustment. Like lots of bad stuff happened with Silicon Valley Bank, and so I expected that at this point in time we would be seeing a huge fall off in interest in defense tech, and that did not happen. Actually, I think it's actually been pretty stable, and that's I think given people a lot of confidence. And I want to ask you, where do you think we are in the broader trend? Do you think interest in this is ebbing, flowing, stable? Do you predict it's going to climb? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so interest is at an all-time high, right? I mean, as you mentioned, I've been looking at defense tech for over a decade now, and I can tell you it's hotter now than it's ever been. Zooming out a little bit, let's talk about where it's going to go, right? I think that there are, call it half a dozen ideas, half a dozen technologies that truly can shift the global superpower balance. The startups today that can get those right are going to be the primes of tomorrow. So there's going to be some huge outcomes, right? But I did say that's like a half dozen, and there are hundreds of startups today. And a lot of those companies are getting funded, and undoubtedly the frothiness is going to go away, which means that it's not going to be a straight up and to the right path. Never is in innovation, right? There are some hype cycles that just go away entirely. I don't think this is one of them. I think, again, like there are those half dozen ideas that are going to result in huge companies and be the primes of tomorrow. And a lot of the lesser ideas, the more tactical ideas, are probably going to get tucked into into those winners or go away, which means that somewhere between now and some investors making a lot of money, there's going to be a lot of investors that lose a lot of money, right? Sure. I think that call it inefficiency, you might look at it, is a pretty natural part of the innovation ecosystem, right? If we truly were trying to be, as investors, as founders, just like one shot, one kill about every idea, you just wouldn't see the amount of innovation that you see in the world today, right? Quantity has a quality all of its own, and that's the phase we're in now.
Makes sense.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So I love that perspective because it's coming, straight from the source, from the VC. What I can add to that is how the government sees it, the demand signal side. Their interest in private capital is not going away. It's only increasing. Everyone complains about how slow the DoD is. It's a big ship. So it's slow to get places, but man, when it's there, it's also slow to leave. And so, they'll be once they get to the party, they'll stay there and drink the beer, right? And so the interest is not waning. They see it as one of our superpowers that we have in the U.S., this great capital markets, but also every time, I spend a lot of time talking to 3- and 4-star generals, political appointees. When new ones come in, they're really interested in this. They're like, whoa, this innovation stuff, I gotta get some of this. Let's go with this, right? And so again, when people sometimes see that as a downside, when folks change out, general officers might change every 3 years, I look at it as an upside because it's renewed interest. Every 3 years, someone's coming in and they're like new to this scene and they're thinking, this innovation stuff's great, this commercial sector stuff's great, I want some of this. So I think it's not going away.
Do you think there's a chance it's a bubble?
That implies it's going to burst.
Yeah, and if you think it's a bubble, when do you think it will burst? Or do you think, Dan is saying no, it's at an all-time high, it's going strong.
So to be clear, I do think we're in a valuation bubble, right?
Okay.
But that's a very different phenomenon than, what I'll call like a fundamental bubble, where there's excitement about something that's just not going to work out. Even if you look at, for example, the worst valuation bubble in, the history of humankind, it's probably like the tulip mania of, the Netherlands or whatever. Well, yes, those prices ran out of control. But today tulips are still a thing, right? People aren't like, oh, I would never buy one of those, right? And so I think, we can still kind of get to the place we need to, which is adopting technology as a nation that gives us the advantage that we need, that leads to the success of, call it a half dozen or so startups that become tomorrow's primes, which, by the way, there's only a half dozen primes today. So what I'm saying is not like a crazy thing in history, right? But, we can still get there, and there can still be turbulence in between. Right?
Sure, but also, I think you have to remember that we got to the number of primes we do because of very deliberate industrial policy. And, if you go back during when you had, let's say, a similar defense spending frenzy like we did in the Cold War, we had dozens of primes. So I think I think we are living through the deconsolidation of the industrial base, where we now have people that want to compete against primes to become, as you said, the new primes. And there's, as you said, there's 6 technology areas. DoD says there's 14 technology areas. There's space to have a much more complex and a much more competitive landscape. I think one of the things that we wrestle with is the role that, as Chris was quick to point out, it's not just the drones, it's the software stack on the drones, is that when we had the formation of the primes, it was an industrial era. Now we're living in a sort of post-industrial, more software-defined warfare era. And so I'd love to ask you guys, how do you think that's going to affect what the shape of this industry looks like when you have the uncoupling of hardware and software in certain areas, and then in others, you need even tighter hardware-software coupling to achieve the results in quantum or AI or certain stuff like that?
There is this amazing moment, right? The co-author of my forthcoming book, Unit X, Rod Shaw, started a venture capital company, and their largest, their anchor investor is one of the primes. So we're seeing this willingness to really mix it up in new ways, and I think that's really exciting. We have primes now invested in VCs that are talking to startups. We also have startups that have become unicorns, right? Defense tech unicorns. So the ecosystem, in my mind, is really blossoming.
Exciting. So I'm going to switch gears, different round of questions for you guys, and then after that, I'm going to turn it over to the audience members. So you guys should start thinking about your questions and your topics, and we have a mic here, so I'll just let you guys line up and have at it. So I want to turn to the topic of advice for the audience, because we talked about the things that we like to talk about. Let's talk about the things that they want to talk about. And let's talk about what are the things that are going to matter for them. And I think about, we have entrepreneurs in the audience, we have investors in the audience, and I also see we have some government leaders in the audience here that are the customers that are trying to figure out how to bring this technology into their missions. And so, Chris, I want to ask you, when you were at DIU, when you were advising the generals that were coming through for their Silicon Valley tourism that Alexis and I were talking about, which they still do, what is the advice you give them on how to be a better buyer? Like, how do you help coach the government into being more effective as a customer working with startups? What do you think is most important?
Yeah, well, you're a better buyer when you show up with money. Right.
Okay. That helps, right?
And so this leads me to my biggest advice for everyone in the audience, both entrepreneurs, investors, and government officials, is a kind of strategic patience. I think Ukraine and the other threats we're seeing around the world, which are all similar in character, if you look at how advanced technology is being employed, advanced commercial technology is being employed in each. I really do think we have hit this incredible moment where there's just a much broader and deeper awareness now in the Congress, in the Pentagon, about the kind of world that we're moving into. Replicator, one of the reasons why Replicator is a squishy, hard to get your head around initiative is it was started off budget, just like DIU. There's no budget for Replicator. It was made up. Now, it's directionally the right thing to do. We're moving out. The budgets will come. There's too much commitment and too much realism about what Replicator is and the problem it's trying to solve for it to go away. So I think if we're all really patient, look, DIU got marked for a budget of $1 billion this last cycle. We'll see what the appropriators actually give, but we're on the cusp, I think, of DoD actually being able to show up with real resources for this community.
And let me just use that as a jumping off point to make a quick infomercial. If someone thinks there's a criticism that your new idea shows up in the ecosystem unfunded, I disagree. Because to get something funded means that you thought of it 3 years ago. And we're talking about the technology cycles that we're in and also the geopolitical cycles that we're in. Every truly new good idea will happen not in the context of a planning, programming, budgeting, execution future year's defense program budget. It will always start unfunded. So I give a lot of credit to people in the system brave enough to make these new launches. And most of the exciting, interesting new things have fit that mold. And then later, there's a battle to figure out how to get them funded. Now, there has just been a Planning, Programming, Budgeting, Execution Commission that launched their final report only 3 days ago. And they are trying to solve that problem because it shouldn't need 3 years notice to do a new important thing. And when I look at the startups that we're investing in and the startups that we're advising and the program offices that are on technology, they really need to be able to buy things, sell things, and do things in a faster time horizon. And so I think if there's one really, really important, not super sexy, but one really important issue, it's actually budget reform. So I encourage all of you, please look at the PPBE Commission report. It will not be the hottest thing that gets tweeted about at South by, but some of you, please send it a tweet. It's a really important topic.
I just want to double click on what you said.
Please.
There's a thing that you mentioned in there that I'm in just violent agreement with, right? Which is that I don't think it is a failure when something shows up half-baked, right? It shows, it shows momentum in the right direction. Oftentimes, it helps advance thinking. The analogy I think of is one thing I really had to adjust to in the Marine Corps is this idea that like the second best plan executed aggressively is often better than sitting around waiting for the best plan, right? And
Hear, hear.
I think that one thing that's worth, lawmakers and appropriators thinking about is our troops are out there doing that. In an imperfect world with imperfect tools and imperfect information, they're going to take that risk, right? And what we can do to best support them is to similarly make aggressive decisions with imperfect information, imperfect risk, aggressively in a way that kind of matches the effort that's going on in the field. If the more time we spend ivory tower style, like trying to think of like the perfect answer that's going to like hit all the wickets of all the different incentives that are in the system, that's just more time we're leaving people in the field hanging without the tools that they need.
And to further pile onto that, so I specialized in acquisition reform.
Yeah.
And after so many years of doing this, it started to become very clear to me, I could not get the process to move any faster until we made adjustments to the adjacent processes, the requirements process and the budget process. And in fact, right before I left the Army to go up to the Secretary of Defense's office, one of the initiatives that we were working on in my office had to do with funding. Now, I didn't own it inside the acquisition office, but I worked with the comptroller to try to get it done.
That's a great segue. So it is true, you do need to get the requirements process, the acquisition process, the budgeting process, and the buyer all to agree. So it does take about 1,000 committees to make a lot of money in DoD, which brings you to the title of this session, which was, it's not an easy market. Actually, the original title was censored by South by. It was a much more accurate description of what this market is like. But that's why I wanted to ask you, Alexis, what would be your top advice for founders looking to navigate all those different committees and processes and cycles and requirements? What do you tell them?
So many things come to mind. I'll keep it brief. Top level. So for anyone who's defense curious, who might not really know that much about this market, it's a tough market for economic reasons, right? It's not anything any one person can change. So I think it's important, I personally think it's important to have dual-use technology, not military-specific or military-unique technology, because it can help. It's good for the government, right? Because it helps, commercial investment helps to burn down the technical risk. So by the time it gets to them, it's a little bit more of a fleshed out idea. More importantly, on the business side, you're able to keep yourself running through the lean years because the government buys so sporadically, and it takes a very long time for them to actually make a purchase or get on contract. So that's important. And I recognize, especially for smalls and for startups, it's really hard to invest in two different revenue lines, because it often means different teams, different processes. The government's got its unique requirements, things like that. So I recognize it's a challenge. To add to that, just a simple tip, more tactical, is that most of what I do revolves around helping the incomers, new entrants, understand the process and the players. So you have to really take some time, and sometimes you need a Sherpa, somebody who helps you understand how things work. It's a very technical field, especially acquisition. It's all based on law and regulation for a reason. And so understanding the process and understanding the players, you got to invest in those relationships. And here's a tip for pitch decks. They should not be any longer than 10 slides. You should not overcrowd those slides, and you can expect to only get 30 minutes, including Q&A. So you really got to hone and refine that messaging.
That's awesome. So Dan, you are getting more pitches than I can imagine. A lot of the people in the space are going to always want to stop at your office, and they're hopeful getting that seal of approval from you. When the founder leaves the room, what is the most frequent critique that you're hearing? Like, what are some of the common mistakes that you want to tell people now? Like, please, I recommend avoiding these things.
Yeah, so it's the same thing I find myself saying most when the founder's still in the room, right? Which is that the typical way founders go wrong is that they're picking too small an idea. And I can understand why. I can empathize with that, right? A lot of defense tech founders come from a military background, and they remember in their experience something that wasn't great, right? Maybe it was, hey, like remember how bad our night vision goggles were? Yeah, they were terrible, right? Like, do you remember, like how terrible our radios were? Yeah, they were awful, right? But, this is an industry that has massive advantages to incumbency. And so if your idea is not big enough to warrant,
right,
truly blowing up what's already there, if you're not building something from a technology perspective that truly even the government can see the primes of today could not build, then you're setting yourself up for all the same downside with not the right amount of upside.
Right, 10% better radio, good luck with Harris.
That's actually
just obliterating you.
Exactly the example I give, right? Like
Yeah.
if you build a radio that has 10% more range, right? Like that's 10% better. Don't start a company over that. Do something that's truly going to shift the global superpower balance, right? Invent the autonomous AI drone swarm or whatever it is, right? Something that's going to actually change the power balance between the US and China in a way that the primes can't deliver.
That is a very high bar to clear, but a very powerful question to ask. So that's a great note for not an ending, but a pause. And we can turn to mics. I have a lot more questions, but I want to make sure you guys have a chance to get your questions in. So please state your name, tell us who you are, and ask a one-part succinct question.
Okay, well on that, I'm Elias Stahl, the CEO and founder of Hilos. We're a generative design and digital manufacturing company out of Portland, Oregon that is helping onshore and reshore advanced manufacturing. And one, I just want to say thank you for, I think to me, seeing the DoD presence at this South by signals what all of you are talking about, which is the big aircraft carriers taking it seriously and trying to incorporate a lot more innovation and change. But at the same time, I'm also hearing we need to have patience, 3-year cycles. And so I want to ask, what are we learning from Ukraine, specifically when it comes to acquisition strategies? And what are we thinking of incorporating ourselves?
Can I jump on this one?
Yeah, go.
I love this. And I also love the fact that you're working on advanced manufacturing. It's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, actually, you wanted to talk about manufacturing, so this is your opening.
This is a trend.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, you're hit on something that I had asked Josh if we could talk about. So, as terrible as it is what's happening in Ukraine, the bright spot is that it has shown the DoD the fragility of its defense industrial base. And I would say this is a big trend, that over the last year we've really started to realize that we need to galvanize and strengthen the defense industrial base. It does not just mean it doesn't mean propping up what's there, it means getting more people. And it also means investing in things in a new way. And so advanced manufacturing is a critical thing. Let me just say this for a moment. We all talk about innovative tech getting into the hands of the warfighter. We rarely talk about innovative tech going into industrial operations. And I feel like this is a real opportunity. So if there's any like capital guys out there, think about that. Also think about, since the DoD is so focused right now on the fragility of its supply chain, the weaknesses of its industrial base, and they're taking actions now to move out and try to improve that. They just recently released a defense industrial strategy, and there is, probably going to be resources going into this. I would also argue they've done a really good job of mapping and assessing where the weaknesses are in the supply chain. I mean, it's written in a report since 2022. It's evident of where they want cash spent. So I would definitely draw your attention to that, the supply chain reports and whatnot.
And we have seen
Yeah.
very hot startups pivot into advanced manufacturing of munitions just in the last few months to meet the demand. So it is an adjacency. We had hypersonic engine companies moving into making munitions. So, and also, sometimes it takes 3 years. We've also seen, AFWorks do contract awards in 15 minutes on credit card swipes. So it doesn't always take a long time. We've gotten better at making it go a lot faster sometimes. I do want people to feel encouraged and a bit bullish about the defense market. Any others want to take a crack at that, or we move to the next question? Feeling good about that? Great. All right.
One thing I'd
Sure.
I'd speak to is, you mentioned, you're hearing, hey, you need to be patient to crack the market. I'd actually frame it a different way. I actually think impatience is necessary, right? As a founder, you can't be like, oh, hey, you know what? My investors and the market expects me to generate this kind of revenue, but I'm going to be patient. Doesn't necessarily work, right? You have to live in the world that you're in. However, I think what is required is the grittiness to not be discouraged, right? So, there's going to be many more disappointments along the way. It's not like building a web SaaS product where it's like, hey, within 6 months you can kind of figure out the sales efficiency and you put in $1 of sales effort here, $3 of revenue comes out there. It's not like that, right? Every year is a fight, every year is a struggle, but the pieces that break loose are, these 8-figure contracts that you would never see in the commercial world. And so, if it's not working, the answer isn't necessarily to be patient, right? You just got to attack in a different direction and you be much more gritty about that. But I think you still need to think about it as like, hey, if I'm not driving the same kind of growth as like a commercial startup would, I need to, I still need to achieve those goals.
Yeah, really appreciate that, and I appreciate the support for advanced manufacturing. Just to draw back to the original question, though, is there anything specifically with how Ukraine was able to really pivot quickly and adopt advanced technologies at a breakneck speed that we want to implement ourselves that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think that in the munitions realm, there's been additional, the Army on things like 155 rounds has put in, they started to program and implement a very large investment, so $15 billion over 15 years, at their sites, the ammunition production sites. So that includes a lot of automation. And so you can see, now that's usually done with the primes, but I think that they're kind of just coming to the party with some of these advanced manufacturing techniques, but they're getting there. And I think that automation is a key one. In other words, robotics. But I'd like to see more AI and sensing and things like that as well. But we're definitely seeing it in automation.
Yeah, no question, faster is better, right, for acquisition cycles. In that sense, we are more like Russia than we are like the Ukraine, right? Yeah. The Ukraine is like buying stuff, building stuff, trying it out over the weekend, funding stuff the next week. That's not what we've got here, right? And I think we can all do a lot to put pressure on the government to continue to drive the reforms. Anytime I meet with anyone who's senior in the acquisition machine in DoD, I'm trying to feed them ideas that not that they'll adopt the idea, but kind of drive the urgency of the point that you're making, right? I've pushed on the idea of hey, you know what? For every deploying unit, every Lance Corporal should get a $200 Amazon gift card so that they can buy the gear that they need, right? Stuff like that that'll just draw into focus the super importance of flexible spending at the unit level, right? However, as a founder, you can't wait for those things to happen. There is a system that exists today. It's not perfect, but it is something that can be navigated, and big companies have been built around it, right? And so, yes, we should absolutely push anyone who's in any level of responsibility for more flexibility and tighter acquisition cycles. But in the meantime, we can't wait either.
Appreciate it.
So,
Thank
and
you.
I'll just, moderator's prerogative. What I see is that you have to look at 3 different axes simultaneously. One is speed of action to response to what's going on in world events. The second is size of the investment, the amount of money being invested in whatever that response is. And the third is the longevity or durability of that investment. So what I see happening is there are a lot of elite units, small units, agile units, or what I would describe as innovative formations, organizations that are designed to be adaptive or rapid, that are doing all kinds of super cool rapid experimentation around the things that they're seeing. And they're buying stuff in order to do their experimentation. But they're not making large investments that will scale, and they're not making investments that are going to have staying power over time. So they are very exciting for a startup to iterate with those small units or those teams, and you can get contracts quickly to do that. But you don't see that immediately translating into this is a long-term investment, and that we call that valley of death problem. But I see incredible things going on in different units to respond to what's happening, either directly supporting engagements with our allies or in other ways. And so there is a huge uptick, for example, in unmanned systems companies making pitches all over the place, even new companies being formed. We see all of that. But the question is, how long does it take you to put your company together and to get the investment, and for that do we believe that those things are going to become, I don't want to use the word program of record, but they're going to become, let's say, longer term, higher dollar commitments? And I think that's the big question around acquisition reform.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Sure.
So I'm going to kind of segue off what he was asking. So I've done a lot of work with DLA. And one of my recent experience, I won't name the weapon system, but it's a major weapon system that everybody's heard of. And the Army analyzed the production of that process, because if you run out, it's 2 years. And they were asked to go back and look at it again. Hey, guess what? They came back and said, it's 2 years to make any more of those. Okay, we don't have time for that. Okay, shooting war is going to come along. We're going to run out of ammo in 2 months. I mean, what are we going to do? And how can startups really help that? By the way, my name is Greg Pepis, ex-Incutel. I'm at Boca Capital now.
Thank you, Craig. This feels like an Alexis question.
What is the question?
Well,
I think.
Like, what do we do when we run out of something and
well,
we're afraid
the
we're
big
going to run
question
out
is,
of it?
how can we leverage this community of startups to really answer some of these tough problems when a prime is building a weapon system and they can't get around themselves and the major, agency like the Army or the Navy in a shorter period than 2 years? We're going to lose a war in 6 months. We're not going to last 2 years in a major shooting war to wait for a major weapon system to get more ammo built, for example. I mean, howitzers are a prime example of that. We had a lot of those shells, but it's been around forever. I mean, some of these other weapon systems, how can startups contribute to making that more rapid? And that's an important thing, I think, that we all need to be aware of. So.
What do you think?
Okay, so there's a lot of different ways you could go with that, right? One, I'm seeing a lot more teaming than I used to with the primes on large integrated platforms.
Yep.
So you mentioned Army, right? So here's an example from Army. So the replacement to the Bradley, so right? XM30, this is a vehicle. So in the old days, it would have been Prime A versus Prime B. Now it's a team led by a prime, one prime, and another prime. But the important thing that I'm noticing is that it's a collection of companies, and more importantly, when it was 4, and it was recently down-selected within the last year to 2, the difference to me between who was selected, who was down-selected, versus who got left behind, was that the 2 teams that survived had teamed with innovative digital engineering type firms. So one Anduril, the other advanced, right, so So we're seeing more. So it's like we're finally seeing the Army put its money where its mouth is, and they are committed to digital engineering, they're committed to new innovative tech, and it's demonstrated with actual source selection and who gets picked. So this is a good improvement. And I think that, and by the way, I think that's something to be said here for startups, for new non-traditionals coming in. One of the sort of misconceptions, I guess, I get sometimes is people that are very excited to sell to the government, and they often think, okay, so I've got this thing, I'm going to be selling it to the government. Yes, much of the work that you will be doing to be seen by the government, to prototype it, to get some advancements in R&D, it will eventually lead to a business-to-business sale. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. The government doesn't buy gadgets and gizmos. The government buys integrated platforms. And guess who sells the platforms? The primes. And so many times, these things will fold into a larger platform. So it's sometimes a correction.
Like the F-35 has 60,000 suppliers, and a lot of them are small businesses. So I think it's a good point to be is like, particularly for these depot maintenance, sustainment, logistics contracts, I think it's really important to think about B2B sales and B2B strategies. And I also think was interesting you talk about these contracts. It's, what I see happening is like if you compare it to electoral politics, you always have the like old white guy incumbent politician that's been running for 30 years on the ticket, but they're choosing running mates that are like young, dynamic, hot new candidates. And so now these runoff elections for primes is not always like one super old, tired stentorian politician against another super old, tired stentorian politician. You have really dynamic tickets now. And I think for startups, it's ideas like, you're going to pick and choose whose ticket you want to be on, and you're thinking, in these three-dimensional strategies of like how to jump on there. And I think for some of these depot maintenance issues, you might be able to be like, hey, you guys have an enormous amount of risk on resupplying this platform, and the Hill is beating you up on this, and there's IG investigations and reports on how you're behind on this. I have a way to help take risk off your balance sheet, and I can make it better, faster, cheaper for you. And it's not the government you're pitching, right? Maybe it's Lockheed or Boeing or General Dynamics or something like that.
I'll give a slightly more startup-y answer.
Good,
right?
please. You could use that right now.
Yeah, which is that if there is something that is taking 2 years to produce and you're a startup, don't try and help that. Leave that for dead, right? A munition that takes 2 years to re-up, not a useful munition in the modern day and age. And I think the example you gave is like a perfect one, right? How long does it take for us to build back our supply of artillery shells, right? I mean, there shouldn't be artillery in this day and age. My opinion, like you should be able to call in a grid and loitering munitions show up and just take out that target. I don't care that it's brought in by an F-18 or artillery or anything like that, right? But if whatever the product is requires that kind of a design cycle, it's never going to be able to be impactful to the battlefield in a timely manner. Let's just leave all those things for dead and think about, what can we invent that obviates the need for something like that? I think that's the better way to tackle it as a startup.
I'm so glad you said that. Way better answer. Everybody good. Here we go. Ma'am.
Hi, panel. Angela Speedo. I'm the managing director for the Mission Acceleration Center. It's an OUSD program, kind of new. We're a new kid on the block. So I have the prerogative of asking spicy questions because I like spicy things. I am not a huge fan of us comparing where we're at right now to what's happening in Ukraine because that means people are dying. So if we're asking what do we need to do to be like Ukraine, that means that we've lost Americans. And so what I'd prefer to be thinking about and what I'm encouraging my teams to think about is how can we actually do something now to make sure that another American doesn't die because we failed at integrating new technology faster. And so that's kind of my question to you, is what is one thing that each of you thinks we need to fix or change now so that we don't lose another American in the future? And please, pretty please, don't say policy, because not a single one of us in the room has the ability to influence that.
Well, first of all, it's not true that...
Chris, I'm going to let you take this.
Yeah, it's not true that none of us have the ability to influence policy. Policy and politics are how change happens. And so if you're not willing to confront that, then we're not going to fix anything else first. I'd say that you actually have to go right back to Ukraine. So, Ukraine is the battle lab of today. We don't have enough people learning what's happening. We don't have people responding. We don't have enough people helping the Ukrainians distill where the key balance points are. So I think Ukraine is a huge opportunity. Now, here are some other people that have figured out the opportunity of Ukraine. Hamas. Hamas had their own little miniature replicator initiative, right, with quadcopters that dropped shape charges on the generators that powered the Israeli border tower communication towers, right? So how did 1,400 fighters pour across arguably the most secure border in the world? Cheap quadcopters is the answer. The Russians are now figuring this out at scale because they've just dropped $1 billion on Iran to build a giant factory that produces quadcopters at a scale that Ukraine probably will not be able to handle. Other militaries in Africa are starting to figure out quadcopters. So I would stare really hard at Ukraine and say that if the United States doesn't come up with a solution to be dominant, to be absolutely dominant in the US and counter-US space, more people are going to die.
Yeah, my response would be overmatch, right? We need to build overmatch capabilities so that there's a strong deterrent effect. That's how we stop wars from happening, is that we are so obviously dominant that people don't want to start wars that might involve America, right? That is also how we protect the lives of Americans if, unfortunately, war does break out, right? When that Lance Corporal goes on patrol, I want that Lance Corporal to have as much overmatch capability as humanly possible. When I look at the last 20 years, I'm not sure we did that, right? Like when we went out on patrol and there was a sandstorm and you couldn't get aviation assets, our guys on the ground were just dudes with rifles fighting dudes with rifles. I would not call that overmatch, right? Like, are our troops better trained? Can they shoot straighter? Can they, run further? Yes, right? That's not a true overmatch capability. If I'm the enemy and I'm looking at America and I see a weak America, that's someone I might go to war with, right? If I see a nation that has its troops so well prepared and with such an overwhelming technology advantage that the answer is clear before it begins, you know what? You find another way, right? And so I think that's the best way to avoid war, just overmatch and deterrence.
Deterrence. Love that. All right. We have 2.5 minutes, and we have 2 more questions, so I'm going to take them both real quick.
Okay. My name is John Rocher. Like Dan, also was a Marine in the early 2000s.
Thank you for your service.
And now I own a consultancy that works in the innovation space, work with companies like Anduril. And so for companies like mine, and I just mean generally consultancies and services and things like that, who aren't founding a company to sell to the DoD or through the primes to the DoD, what can we do to help? A lot of people are asking really good questions about move faster, these kinds of things. What can the rest of us do to get involved, learn, support, and then also what's needed? That would be good information.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Patrick Bowen. I'm CEO, founder of Neurophos. We're an optical AI computing accelerator hardware company for AI. And my question is actually, we've talked a lot in this conversation about drones, advanced manufacturing, things like that at Ukraine. I'm actually curious what the role of AI has been in the war of Ukraine and what the lessons are learned. And also, who are the main customers in the government space that are interested in that? What workloads are interesting?
Okay, so I heard what's the role of AI, and I've heard what can all of us do. Anyone want to jump on one of those?
2 very distinct questions.
I know.
I'll try the one on what can all of us do.
Okay.
If you care about this mission and this purpose, I think right? Like it's just within you. I think that we all have the choice on how we spend our most productive years of our career, right? Like you can choose to, work on, some IT infrastructure problem that is very specific and might cause you to still exit a company for billions of dollars, right? Or you can work on things that have, national consequences, right? And I think that, the more smart, hardworking people we have focused on the purpose of giving the United States that overmatch capability, the stronger place we're going to end up, right? And within that, that's pretty broad, but we each have to find the part of that that resonates with us. Some of us were meant to be startup founders, right? Some of us were meant to be investors. Some of us were meant to lead teams within those growing companies, right? But, you know, the more people that we have focused on the problem and actually not just thinking about it on weekends, but devoting the most productive years of their career to that problem, I think the better a place we're going to be.
Beautifully said, Dan. Thank you. A great closing. Chris, I'm going to ask you to end commenting on the question about AI, because I know that's something you've worked on a lot and thought a lot about, and probably saw some of that in your travels. Can you answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about Ukraine and AI that's just unbelievable is you have small, firms, Ukrainian firms working out of garages that are using open source AI tools to develop, effectively the capabilities of a Tomahawk missile inside a quadcopter. It's astonishing stuff. And so, yes, we are going to see a lot of what's happening in AI right now in Ukraine writ large over the battlefields of tomorrow.
You get the last word, Alexis. Bring us home. Something uplifting, something positive. High note to end on.
I think there's a lot of good work to be done. The fact that you're all here shows promise. I love the question about what can we all do to help, because I think that it is a collective, it's a necessarily collective thing that an endeavor that we're all working on. And I think we each have a piece of it. This is a great panel because, we're all see a little slightly different piece of the puzzle. And I can't stress enough, I think we've all seen some interesting, we've all been inside the DoD, seen some interesting intel over the years, and I think that we all understand the purpose of where we're going and what we could be up against. And so take it from me and from us that this is a very necessary mission, and so, please stay the course and stay committed alongside us.
Absolutely. So there you have it. Defense market, it is a tough business. It is a shit market. But it's good for the country, and you can make a huge success doing it. And I think what you heard most of all from all of our panelists is a real love for the people, the institutions, the mission, and the country, and the passion for not only building incredible companies with amazing founders, but doing it for a cause that we all, and I imagine you all, care very deeply about. So let me close with a big thank you to all of them, not only for joining us today and sharing their insights, but for the careers they've devoted to serving this greater cause. And also a big thank you to Christopher and to ATI for having us for this really important conversation. And last, if you liked what you heard today, then you should buy Chris's book. Unit X. Pre-order on
July
Amazon
9th,
right now.
On Amazon.
I have multiple copies ordered, so that would be, if you liked this, you could read 320 pages of it. Anyway, thank you all very much for joining us. Appreciate it. Big round of applause for us.